time. We're going to get started here. Welcome everybody to the inaugural presentation as part of the Grand Morsels series. My name is Chris Packley. I'm the director of the Regional Math and Science Center at Grand Valley. The vision of the Regional Math and Science Center is that we are inspiring and engaging everyone in STEM. And to that end, we're very excited that you decided to join us here on a Tuesday evening for this conversation here. The Grand Morsels series is envisioned as a way for us to break down some scientific concepts into bite-sized pieces. You'll notice that we've got this great visual here of the cookie. You may have also seen the pie in its various slices. Our goal here is to really provide an opportunity for our College of Liberal Arts and Sciences faculty to engage with K-12 teachers, K-12 students, GVSU faculty, staff, students, and our community members in order to just have conversations around scientific concepts and concepts that lead us to understand better the fact that STEM really is all around us at all times. To that end, we are very pleased for us to introduce and welcome our presenter tonight, Dr. Len O'Kelly. Dr. O'Kelly is part of the GVSU School of Communications, and you'll see the title of his presentation here. I'll hand it over to him in just a second. I'm going to do a couple of quick housekeeping items. The first is that we are going to hold all questions to the end. So the sort of format of our conversation here tonight is that Dr. O'Kelly is going to be having a conversation, having a presentation at the start here, and then we'll open it up to some conversation near the end. So you can expect that about 30 minutes or so of this night is going to be Dr. O'Kelly's presentation. Then we'll open it up for what we anticipate is probably about 15 minutes of question and answer, but if it goes longer, then we're happy to have that go longer. We are recording this, or we're planning to record this conversation, and we will be posting it to the Grand Morsels website so that if you missed a portion of this, or if you miss a future one, but you'd still like to have an opportunity to engage with it, then you will be able to see that on the Grand Morsels website. So look for that. Kathy Agee here tonight, you'll see her title is Kathy Tech Support. If you're having any technical issues tonight, please make sure to just send her a message, and she is very glad to help you in any way. You'll be able to just have a conversation with her to get any tech issues solved. And then finally, you should expect to see a follow-up email in the next couple of days, which will introduce you to the next installation of the series, as well as provide some opportunity for you to give us some feedback on the way that tonight went, the way that your experience happened, and any potential ideas that you might have for the future. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Dr. Len O'Kelly for his inaugural talk in the Grand Morsels series.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome everybody. I'm very glad to see that you've come over on a Tuesday night to talk a little radio. So quick little bit about myself before I jump into the presentation here. I am a professor in the School of Communications at Grand Valley State University. My primary classes that I teach include things like Introduction to Radio, where I train the next generation of people to be in the radio, and also media history. So this talk is kind of an intersection of both of those two things. And full disclosure, before I became a college professor, I was one of those rock and roll disc jockeys you hear about. So I spent about 25 years of my life getting up at the very dark hours of the morning and heading into radio stations and playing records. So it was important for me to understand how all this technology worked. And when I have the ability to share a little bit about how communications and science work together, I'm always very excited to take that opportunity. So I'm very glad to be able to have this chat with you tonight. So let's talk a bit about radio. Why does it matter anyway? Isn't radio dead? Isn't radio 20th century technology? Isn't it a thing that's no longer relevant? AM and FM radio is the most used medium in the United States today. 92% of the American public tunes into the radio every week. It's still very viable. What I like to share with my students is 90% of the American public buys toilet paper, according to market research surveys. So radio is bigger than that. But it's also far bigger than the internet or Facebook or any single social media platform. So it's still important. At the turn of the last century, Time magazine put out a list of what they thought were the most important inventions of the 20th century. And radio was a little disappointed to come in number 2. They put the automobile first. And I realize this is near heresy, speaking in Michigan, but I think they got it backwards, actually. I think that radio might have been number 1. And the automobile might have been number 2. And the simple reason I say that is I have days I don't use my automobile. There are no days ever where I don't use the technology that is radio. And I'll share a little bit of why that is with you. But let's go back in time just a bit. In order for us to really think about the idea of communicating over long distances, we have to consider that we've been doing it for a very, very long time. In fact, we're coming up on the 200th anniversary here in fairly short order. It's 185 or so, roughly. But a guy named Samuel Morse came up with an invention called the telegraph in 1837. And we really don't use telegraphs anymore because radio replaced it. But for its time, the telegraph was a very key development in long distance communication. What the telegraph made possible was the ability to send a message over very long distances. And in a way, it was extremely simple. The way the telegraph worked was you simply generated an electric current and sent that current through wires. And when you turned the current on, the current went up and through the wire and went to the other end of the wire where it activated a magnet and made a clicking sound. And by turning that current on and off in a pattern, you were able to send messages over great distances. In a sense, the technology is so simple. When I was putting this presentation together, I was reminded of my my third grade teacher at Kirby School back in the Chicago area, Mrs. Beatty, who gave me the time out of class to build a telegraph with a battery and a set of wires and whatnot. And when you pressed the button, the magnet made the thing click. So even a third grader could do it. So in a sense, it's very, very simple. However, where the technology is more complex is that in order for this to work, you need to understand Morse code. I would do a quick show of hands how many of you know Morse code, but I usually know the answer to that question before I ask it, and it's not many people do. Unless you are fluent in that code, then the language is a little tougher to make sense out of, right? It just sounds like a lot of short and long clicks in a pattern, basically, right? But the telegraph is still extremely important. By 1844, Morse demonstrates that it's possible to go very, very long distances with telegraph signals. In fact, in a very famous demonstration in 1844, he sets up and sends a message from Washington to Baltimore. The message, of course, that he sent in Morse code was "What hath God wrought," which was one of the first messages sent long distance in any form in the world's history, right? So immediately people realized there is some utility to all of this. The American Civil War was perhaps the biggest test and display of the power of the telegraph. Union armies used the telegraph to move troops and supplies. And Confederacy, one way that we were able to strike against Confederate targets was taking down their telegraph lines and interrupting that flow of communication between cities. So long distance communication became a very important weapon of war as well. But as you can see in the picture I've put up here, one of the problems with the telegraph were those wires all over the place. So what if we could get rid of the wires? What if we were able to just send that power through the air and get the message from one place to another? Scientists went to work on this right away. The first experiments in what we now know as radio really start in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. So who's responsible for getting us from the telegraph to the radio? The answer is actually a whole lot of people, right? Experiment upon experiment was built on for a period of about 50 years to get us from, wouldn't it be great if we could send the signal through the air without wires, to what if we could just talk to the people and let them know what we need so that nobody has to learn a secret code or any sort of means by which to obscure the meaning of the message. So all of these people on the screen played a very important part in the development of radio, from James Clerk Maxwell here at the top left, who started in 1865, to Heinrich Hertz over here, who realized that it was possible and then gave up on it right away, saying, it's probably not going to amount to anything. Tesla pretty much had it figured out here, but Tesla doesn't get the credit he deserves. Notice I have one picture here bigger than everybody else's, and that's the guy down there in the bottom left. His name is Guglielmo Marconi. And if you've heard of a famous figure in radio, you've probably heard of Marconi. Marconi didn't invent radio by any means. He had the best public relations team. In the early part of the 20th century, messages sent by wireless radio were referred to as Marconigrams. He picked up the patents for things. In fact, even today, the broadcasting industry awards top radio stations every year, and the award they win is the Marconi Award. So he's the one that gets a whole lot of the credit, right? So we are indebted to really all of the contributions of all of these scientists to get us where we are. So let's talk about that science a little bit. How does this thing work? How is it that a disc jockey sitting in a studio can have a conversation and you hear it in your home, in your car, or all of that? Here's basically how it works. The sound from the studio, whether it's the voice of the disc jockey or the record that they're playing, notice I'm of a certain age, I still call them records. Whatever that sound is that's being generated in the studio is sent to a device called the exciter. And the exciter is a part of what we call a chain in broadcasting. There's a chain of machines basically strung together to make this thing happen. So the exciter is a box that generates what we call a carrier wave. The carrier wave is something that you don't think about until you turn your radio on at home. What the carrier wave generates basically is the frequency of the wave that you turn your radio to. So if you want to listen to 104.5 or 105.7 or wherever it is you're setting your radio, what you're tuning in is the carrier wave that exciter creates. So the exciter takes that sound information that's coming from the studio and creates the carrier wave and actually grafts them together into one piece of electromagnetic radiation. That is modulated and sent to a transmitter. Now, transmitter is a word most people know, right? What the transmitter really does is amplifies that signal. Power is added to allow that wave to go long distances. An exciter doesn't generate much power. The signal off of an exciter wouldn't go very far. We need a transmitter to amplify it, to send it over tremendous distances so that we can get it in our homes and cars. After that sound is amplified by the transmitter, that wave is amplified rather, it goes to the antenna. The antenna is the thing you've seen when you're driving down the highway. There's a big stick on the side of the road, probably painted in red and white with lights on it. That's a radio antenna. From that antenna, I like to say, is where space travel happens. The radio wave leaves that antenna and travels all through time and space, right? It covers the entire area based on how powerful that wave is. It could be a distance of maybe a few miles if it's a small little radio station. In the case of some of the giant AM radio stations we have in the country, that signal may go for 1,000 miles. And it travels until it hits another antenna. And the second antenna that it hits is the one in your home or outside of your car. It's the one on your radio at home. That antenna, whether you can see it or not, grabs that wave out of the air and routes that radio wave to a device inside the radio called a detector. The detector basically kind of decodes the message so that the electromagnetic wave is turned back into something we can understand. Once it's decoded by the detector, it goes to the speaker. And once it comes out the speaker, you hear the song, you hear the music, you hear whatever it is that the radio personality is saying. And the magic of all of this is that it happens at the speed of light. Radio waves don't travel at the speed of sound because they are electromagnetic waves. They actually travel at the speed of light. So all of this happens immediately. And it happens thousands of times a second as waves are oscillating. And it happens in 25,000 different radio stations across the United States at the same time. Well, let's go a little bit deeper and talk about some of these particular waves. So I basically gave you just a general sort of outlook to explain, radio waves are created, they travel, right? Are they all the same? No. Radio waves are made in different ways, rather, and they occur on different wavelengths. I'll explain what I mean here. So there's two main types of waves that we think about in radio. And I mentioned in the last 2 slides ago that radio waves are modulated. And what that means is they're manipulated in some way so that the information that is carried in that wave is affected. And there's 2 ways that a wave can be modulated. We could either change the amplitude of the wave, which, as you see I have down here at the bottom, the amplitude of the wave is the height of that wave. We also could change the frequency of the wave, and the frequency is how fast does that wave cycle from start to finish? Those types of radio waves we refer to as amplitude modulation, AM, or frequency modulation, FM. So that's what those letters mean. If you've ever been wondering why they appear on your radio, it's actually a bit of shorthand for a technical method of how we manipulate the radio wave to get it to go through space. Remember I mentioned Heinrich Hertz a bit ago. We actually honor Hertz in radio by naming a very important term after him, and that's wave frequency. 1 hertz is 1 cycle per second. So if you look at the picture I have down there at the bottom right of the screen, for the time for that radio wave to start, hit its top of its amplitude, come back down to the middle, go back down to the bottom, and come back to the start again and complete its cycle. If it does that 1 time per second, we say that the frequency of that wave would be 1 hertz. Radio waves go a lot faster than that, though. We typically measure them in kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz. The same prefixes that we use for computer storage apply to radio frequencies. So a kilohertz frequency really means 1,000 times every second. 1 kilohertz would be 1,000 times a second that wave is doing its thing. Megahertz, like FM radio uses, would be 1 million times a second. I'm not even going to try to move my hand that fast. And if we get into gigahertz, where we're talking about Wi-Fi and routers and all those things, then we're dealing in billions of times per second. So there's a lot of activity going on with these electromagnetic waves. Okay. Why do we have 2 types? Why don't we just have AM? Wasn't AM good enough? Well, for a long time, AM radio was good enough. When radio was first perfected and sent, all we had was AM radio. In the wall of pictures I had there of the men who developed things, the last picture that I showed you was a man named Edwin Armstrong, who is perhaps my favorite inventor out of all of them in radio, because he's the guy that invented FM radio. And the reason he did it was very simple. First of all, he liked classical music and he wanted it to sound better. And if you've ever listened to music on an AM radio, it's a little lacking, right? But what Armstrong really wanted was radio broadcasting that was free from interference. AM radio, amplitude modulation radio, is very susceptible to interference from electricity. If you've ever listened to an AM radio station during a thunderstorm, you know what I mean. The electricity that's generated by the atmosphere interferes with the radio broadcast, and you hear that crackle in the speakers. FM doesn't do that because it's using a totally different set of frequencies that's beyond the reach of electricity, right? So through a lot of politics, quite honestly, that go far beyond the scope of this lecture tonight, suffice to say, Armstrong's system wasn't widely accepted. The short version is RCA, who sold billions of radios, liked AM just fine, thank you very much, and did whatever they could to make it difficult for Armstrong's system to catch on. But it finally did. But it was very slow to adapt. It's not until 1979 that FM radio finally beats AM radio in the United States. And a little bit of trivia, the very first FM radio station in the country to be #1 in the ratings was in Grand Rapids, Michigan in 1970. The old Wood FM was the #1 station in town when it was playing what could best be described as elevator music. But it was the first time ever that an FM station beat all the AM stations. So it's a fairly old technology going back to the 30s, but its popularity is still reasonably recent. So back to the different types of waves. How big are these things? What if we could see radio waves? How much space are we talking? The frequency of the wave determines how big it is. And I'll say that it's a good thing we couldn't see radio waves, because it would be very hard to see where we're going on the way to work. Radio waves range from being massively large to unimaginably tiny. AM radio waves are probably the biggest. So we have a radio frequency that we use on our Allendale campus for my students that are learning radio. It's at 900 AM. And if you could visualize the waves of a frequency at 900 kilohertz, those waves would be about 1,100 feet long. They're about a quarter mile from peak to peak. It's a giant wave. My arms are out of my Zoom screen. It's a giant wave at 1,100 feet. This is why whenever you go under a bridge, you can't hear AM radio. Or if you go into a parking structure, you can't hear AM radio. The waves are too big to fit underneath the bridge or into the garage. So that's why you lose that AM signal. It's the size of the wave. It's just too darn big to keep up with you in your car. FM radio waves are a little bit smaller. A station that's very popular with my students is the Top 40 station here in Grand Rapids. It's on 104.5 megahertz. If we could see those radio waves, they're still pretty big. They come in at about 9.5 feet long at that frequency. The higher the frequency you go up the dial, the smaller that wavelength is going to be. So had I picked something like public radio down there in the 88s, those would be much bigger waves. By the time we get to the other end of the FM dial, they start getting smaller. And the even smaller waves are the ones in the gigahertz frequencies. So the things that are coming off of your Wi-Fi router, or if any of you have something like DirecTV or Dish, those are the smallest waves of all, because at that frequency, remember, they're in the billions of hertz. The waves that we use for satellite television are less than an inch across. So compare that 1,100 foot long AM wave to that little, maybe half an inch size wave that's driving the satellite television. This is why when you get a really bad rainstorm, your dish TV goes out, because the raindrops actually interfere with the radio waves because they're closer in size than you would expect. Rain fade's a real thing. Until we find a way to make the waves bigger, we're not going to be able to get around that. But then we wouldn't have the amount of information carried that we use for satellite TV. So the size of the wavelength does make a big difference in terms of its transmission, and also how far those waves can go. The bigger the wave is, the farther it's able to travel through space with a smaller amount of power applied. That's why AM stations can go for hundreds of miles in some cases, whereas FM stations don't nearly have that kind of range because the waves are so much shorter. So far I've just been talking about radio, right? AM and FM radio, right? This is the only thing we use this technology for, right? You use this technology every day because the same basic principle of exciting a wave and transmitting it is used for so many devices every day. So like I said, I haven't used my car today, but I've used a lot of these other things. If you use a television, or you use a cell phone, or you have a remote control for your garage door opener, hopefully many of you don't have guided missile systems in your home and you haven't used one of those today, but it's the same technology that applies. If we're sending information from one point to another somewhere, it's using this exact same technology that gives us music and talk radio. Weather radar uses the same basic technology too. A transmitter sends out a signal, and the information that it's looking for is where's there moisture in the air. So if you're like me and you're hopelessly addicted to the weather app on your phone, you're using this technology all the time too to see where the storms are brewing. I did say television. I like to say that television is just radio with pictures. We started working on television in this country right after radio. Once they had the technology for radio down, they said, boy, wouldn't it be cool if we could just send a picture with this too? And the easiest way to think of a television set is it's a radio that tunes in two frequencies at the same time. When we used to use analog transmission for radio, which now we've switched to digital, and that's a whole different explanation, but analog TV basically used two frequencies at the same time. You simply turned your TV dial, those of us of a certain age who remember, clicking the dial to get a number, but by turning in that number, what you really did was turn on two radio receivers, one for a picture and one for sound. So the old Channel 8, for example, if you had a radio, an FM radio that went far enough down to the 180s, let's say, you could find the picture transmission and you could find the sound transmission. In fact, that's how those old TV sound radios used to work back in the 70s. They basically just picked up the sound frequencies for broadcast TV channels so you could listen to the TV on a pocket radio. So when you turned your TV to Channel 8, that TV knew which two frequencies to go to so that you got picture and sound and transmitted them together at the same time, again at the speed of light, so there was no delay. What are some other things that you can listen to if you're at all curious? Once you start experimenting around with knowing that there's more than just AM and FM, what else is out there? I'm a big weather geek, I'll be honest. So I have a NOAA weather radio in my house. Those are the ones that go off when the weather gets bad, and usually it's about 2 in the morning and it lets me know there's a storm coming. But if you could, again, picture an FM dial that went a little further into the 162s, that's where the National Weather Service has set up a series of frequencies that work all over the United States. And depending where you are, you tune to the weather radio frequency nearest to you, and you can always get weather information 24 hours a day. Police radios use the same technology. I have an app on my phone that monitors police scanners. It's part of my old news background. You like to know what's going on, or what the police are up to on a given night. Have any of my friends gotten in trouble this evening? Which I have heard on the police scanner, but again, that's another story for another night. Police radios work the same way. There's a transmitter and a receiver, and they use the exact same technology. And that's how dispatch works. If you call 911 in an emergency, that dispatcher will turn on a radio transmitter and reach a police officer or a fireman and send that emergency vehicle to you. They can talk over a radio system that's at a different part of the dial. If you tune at FM radio, if you have one that goes far enough and you can get into the 124s and 128s, you can listen to the planes come in and out of Ford Airport. Air traffic control uses the same technology. They send the information through the air and let the pilots know when it's safe to land a plane or when it's okay for a plane to leave. And that's sometimes fun to listen to on a given night as well. And then we have amateur radio. This is still a very viable hobby in the United States. I think the peak for amateur radio use was probably in the 1950s. It's a hobby that admittedly has fewer practitioners than it used to. But there's still a very active group. In fact, Grand Valley State University has an amateur radio club now, and there are young people trying to figure out how to experiment with this technology and do their own broadcasts. Hobbyists in amateur radio use the entire radio spectrum. They're down there in the very, very long waves of AM radio to the very, very short waves of almost satellite broadcasting. There are some amateur radio operators that have figured out how to communicate with the International Space Station. They maintain radio equipment there, and on some nights you can talk back and forth to the space station. The weather geek in me every so often likes to fancy myself a storm chaser, and the storm chasers use the frequencies between 144 and 148. That's where we report the severe weather coming in. So if you ever see a whole bunch of vehicles headed out on the expressway with giant antennas, they're probably driving to where the storm is. You probably want to turn around and go the other way. But storm chasers use that information to keep people safe as well. They're using radio transmission to do it. So wait a second here. All this stuff I told you to go and listen to, can we do that? Is it okay? Isn't that private? Should we be listening to the police department? Should we be listening to the airplanes? This is where law takes over, and we have an intersection now of communication and science and law. In the United States, all of these airwaves that we use and transmit over belong to you. The American people own the airwaves in the United States. A governmental body, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, you've probably heard of, has the task of issuing licenses to people to use the public airwaves. The trade-off is the broadcaster gets to use the airwaves, but because they're ours, we get to listen to what's on them, provided it's not a matter of national security and it isn't encoded. This stuff is all out there for us to consume. You can absolutely listen to it, and I encourage you to do so. You don't want to broadcast if you don't have a license, because that's illegal. We call that pirate radio. And I was just reading a story from a couple of years ago of someone in Boston who was fined $150,000 for setting up a radio station they shouldn't have. And you don't want to get into that trouble. So never broadcast without a license, except when you broadcast all the time without a license. Here's what I mean by that. It is illegal to interfere with a licensed broadcaster. So I can't set up a transmitter in my home and turn the transmitter to 104.5 FM and decide I'm going to do my own top 40 radio program and block out the licensed broadcaster who's on that frequency. That's against the law. You're not allowed to do that. You have to have a license. The government's very clear about who gets rights to use the frequencies. However, there's lots of ways that you can broadcast without a license, and you probably do it every day. The Federal Communications Commission recognizes something in its law called Part 15 of FCC law. And Part 15 basically allows for non-commercial in-home use of broadcast transmitters. And you probably have one in your home. You probably have several in your home, and you never even realized it. I have one, it's out of arm's reach, that actually is a radio transmitter. It's so I could hook my laptop up and dial it in on an FM radio and listen to it in other rooms of my house. But there's other things that work like these transmitters too. If you have wireless headphones, or you have a wireless speaker, or you have a Bluetooth speaker that you use to listen to music in another room, perhaps maybe, you're using one of these transmitters that falls under Part 15 of FCC rules. So that logo I have on the screen there, that's the FCC's logo. It should appear on any legal device for you to use, and there should be an FCC number on it too. Make sure you find both. I have seen knockoff products that you can buy on Amazon that are decidedly illegal for this purpose. So the FCC is very, very particular about what we can and cannot do. We're allowed to use all these little broadcast transmitters in our home, provided we don't interfere with anybody else. If your Bluetooth speaker is interfering with the neighbors, you've probably got a problem there, and somebody's going to end up needing a lawyer. But there are ways to broadcast in an unlicensed fashion. So you just have to be very careful about how you do it. So what about Wi-Fi? Wi-Fi is radio. We have become so dependent on Wi-Fi. What happens when the Wi-Fi goes out at home or at school, right? It's a panic, isn't it? We depend on radio. Think of the router in your home or at your workplace as a radio transmitter. It uses this exact same technology. It works in extremely high frequencies. You'll notice if you ever look at the router that there's probably two frequencies listed. One is something like 2.4 gigahertz and one is 5 gigahertz. Just think of those as really, really tiny wavelengths that are being generated. But what's happening is the exact same. That transmitter, that router, is taking information from a source, in this case, your computer, grafting it onto a carrier wave, sending it through space where it is received somewhere else. It is decoded on the other end. It is the exact same technology as we use to listen to the Tigers game on the radio, or we listen to top 40 music coming into our home, or any of these other principles. So to go back to where I was at the very beginning in terms of what's the most important invention of the 20th century that we use every day, if you've been on the Wi-Fi today, and you're probably on it right now, you're using radio. So it's an extremely important tool that allows us to communicate very quickly without having to string wires all over. I can't imagine what my home would look like if I had to connect all of my devices with cables to get them to talk to each other. There'd be no walking down the hall. It wouldn't happen. So basically, to sum up, if I have 3 morsels for you to take away from this conversation, 3 little cookies you can take home with you. Number one, we've been communicating over great distances for a very, very long time. It seems like it's modern technology because in terms of world history, wireless communication is only about 120 years old. But we've actually been thinking about how to send messages to each other through time and space for a good long time. Also know there are many different kinds of radio waves, right? There's AM, there's FM, there's TV, but all of those waves work in similar ways. And the transmitters work in the exact same way. Once you understand the science of how we get a signal through an exciter, through a transmitter, out an antenna, the other way, just change the different parts of the device, but it's the same technology that's sending that through time and space. And then the third takeaway I have for you is you're broadcasting and you don't know it. Probably at some point today, you engaged in a broadcast, even if it was as simple as pulling out of your garage and pressing a button to close your garage door. You generated a radio broadcast today. And if you're using the internet, you're certainly doing it all the time too. And you may have even, who knows, put on a music station and got a little listen as you were driving around as well. But many of the devices that we have become reliant on use this technology so that we can communicate. Without the science, the communication doesn't happen. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions if there's something I missed or I can help to clarify for you.
Thanks, Len. That was a great presentation. Folks, as we are here in the Q&A section of our presentation here, if you want to pop your questions into chat, I will make sure that Len gets those his way. He's sharing screen, so chat is always a little funky when you're sharing your full screen there. So Len, we had one question that came in that is focused on the detector. So I'm going to read it so I make sure that I get the question correct. So the detector on a radio is set to only interpret the wavelengths that we set our dials to. How then, sort of in a similar fashion, how does a cell phone call only reach you and not other cell phones? How is it that other people can't just sort of listen in the same way that you would with a radio receiver?
That's a great question. That's digital encoding that makes that happen because, so a little bit of criminal admission here, you used to be able to listen to people's cell phone calls, and I used to be able to do it. When cell phone technology first started, it was not digitally encoded. It was using analog signals. And I have an old analog police scanner that I bought in the early 1990s. And one of the things I was amazed to discover about it, I was, how old would I have been? I went to my parents' home to visit one day and I brought it, and I realized that I could hear every cordless phone in the neighborhood. I could hear every cell phone none of it was encrypted, none of it was there. All you had to figure out was what frequencies were the cell phone companies using. So, back in those days, it was Cellular One and Ameritech and companies like that. If you knew their frequencies, you could absolutely listen in on those conversations. The FCC found out about it. They were none too happy, and they tried to pass a law that said it was illegal to listen to those conversations. First Amendment lawyers said, no, it's not. Those are our airwaves. We get to listen to whatever we want. And that's what led to the digital encoding that goes on now. So when you're having a cell phone conversation, you can take heart in knowing that the cell phone company has provided some digital protection for you, and you are only being routed the one frequency to receive and use back and forth. So it is rare that it happens. Sometimes the packets do cross, but the technology's gotten very good in making sure that that doesn't happen anymore. I remember very clearly back in the 90s also listening to a radio broadcast in Chicago where they were interviewing the then governor of Illinois, and cell phone packets crossed, and in a live radio broadcast, instead of getting the governor, they got somebody swearing at someone in traffic because they looped over that way. So that was extra incentive for the cell phone companies to encrypt those phone calls a little better too.
Absolutely.
The governor was a little embarrassed, but yeah, we have some protections. We essentially put our faith in the cell phone companies to encrypt those conversations a lot better so that people like me can't set up an antenna, listen to your business.
Sure. Well, a related question that came in is around how they actually do the encoding that keeps the information secure on Wi-Fi or radio signals and cell phone and that kind of thing. So I don't know if you can talk a little bit about what that encoding looks like.
It deals in digital packets, and I'll be very honest, it is outside the scope of my engineering knowledge. And part of the reason for that is the cell phone companies don't want us to know how they do it. Because if we knew how they did it, we could undo it. But it does use digital packaging and encoding of information so that this also keeps, for example, a T-Mobile call from intercepting with a Verizon call and vice versa. They've all got their own different technologies for doing that, and it falls under a little bit of trade secret. So unfortunately, the only answer I can give you is it's digital packaging that's unique to the particular cell phone company that does it. And it's admittedly outside my scope of knowledge in terms of how they go about doing it.
Well, that's great. We appreciate the clarity and the answer there. If radio waves are everywhere, are they dangerous to us?
Yes and no. It depends on the frequency of the wave. So this question actually came up this past summer at Grand Valley when I set this new radio station up for our students to use. The tower for that radio station is directly above my office. If I could see through my ceiling, I'd be looking at the radio tower. And this was something, believe me, I researched very carefully to know if I'm going to sit under a radio tower all day, is that a bad thing? And it turns out, of course, that in very low power usages and at lower frequencies, it's not so bad. Higher frequencies are at high power are where we do tend to see some danger, right? There are some safety precautions you should always take around radio equipment. If you're right next to a transmitter, for example, it's always a good idea to turn it off before you start tinkering with it. But for most of us, the amount of power that we're near, and by this, I'm talking about this transmitter up to your head while you're having a conversation in line at the post office, this is a fairly low amount of power coming out of here. And test after test after test have shown that it is safe to use. Now, if this were a 50,000 watt transmitter in here, I wouldn't want to put it next to my head. So it has to do with power and frequency. But most of what we encounter every day, we have no worries about.
Couple other questions just came in.
Yes.
So the first is, if listening to airwaves are legal to listen to, is it legal to then decode encrypted data? So that data that's sent over our airwaves, I guess.
Yes, don't tell anyone if you do it.
Okay.
You are entitled, because it's data, it's out there. The data is going through your house right now. It's there, grab it. What you do with it, as long as you don't profit off of that information, then it's legal to do. And again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a communications professor, so don't say the guy said I could do this. Be very careful how you proceed in that. But yes, technically you could if you had the know-how and kept.
Got it. Another question came in about leases for cell phone companies and other radio broadcasters. How long are those leases when a company is leasing the public airways? Do you have any information on sort of what that business venture looks like?
All license terms are set by the Federal Communications Commission, and as such, they're all matter of public record. So if one is genuinely curious about, say, Verizon doing business in your town, fcc.gov is the website. And if you know where to look on their website, all of these licenses and agreements can be found and are available. They are matter of public record. Licenses do need to be renewed. They generally are not forever propositions. They tend to be longer with leases for cell phones than they do for, say, broadcast companies, but there are finite end dates. So they tend to range. Leases also generally, you've got other moving parts here too. You've got tower companies involved. You've got other networks involved. You've got municipalities often want a piece of that action as well. If they're going to have the tower in their city, they want to know that they're getting a little bit of the revenue. There's a lot of moving parts to those agreements. So I would say that those lengths of time of contract vary tremendously. But as is always the case with anything that uses the public airwaves, there's a paper trail and there's a contract that can be found.
Great. There are two more questions in chat. The first is an anecdote that includes a question at the end. So the statement is, on occasion, I pick up the shortwave from someone a street over on the speakers in a radio in my house. It happens to another neighbor as well who's closer, and it comes through their TV speakers while it's off. How might that happen? How do the signals cross like that?
So there's a couple of ways that can happen. I grew up in the Chicago area, 2 doors down from an amateur radio operator who used to interfere with our television all the time. It got a little annoying because it usually happened on football Sundays, most notably. And what ends up happening there is you've probably got either some problem in grounding of the equipment. There is unwanted electromagnetic radiation getting in that shouldn't. Or frankly, you've got somebody operating something that they shouldn't be, or doing something transmitting at a power that they should not be able to use. First step in these cases is always go have a talk with the neighbor and see if they can figure out what's going on. We always involve the FCC as a last resort in that, but technically anything that interferes in your right to watch your television broadcast or listen to your radio station is protected under FCC rules. So you always want to be very careful that everybody's operating properly. Usually it's a simple matter of a grounding wire or something like that, or adding a filter. And back in the day when Radio Shack used to be in business, you could fix it in 5 minutes, but that's not so much the case anymore. But that's usually what causes something like that.
Great, thank you. The final question in chat is sort of related to a question that you answered a little bit, but it's related to 5G technology, and if there are any dangers associated with 5G technology.
We're not there yet. I'm not aware of any specific dangers, but I'm also not in a position to say it's absolutely free, clear, and safe. I think that there's a lot being done with the technology that still needs to be explored. One danger that I am aware of is not a health danger, but it has to do with information that the National Weather Service uses to write its forecasts and issue its warnings. And there is concern about 5G interference getting involved in that network. So the information that we're getting from satellites that are picking up weather, for example, might be compromised with some usages of 5G technology. So I know there's been some concern raised there. Again, this is anecdotal, but there's worry that it might start to affect things like warning times for severe weather events. As far as direct health risks, I don't think we're there yet, but I think there's going to be a lot of research done, as there always is. I mean, we're still constantly double checking to make sure that the radio waves we use, even for AM and FM, are safe for people too. As we're putting, more people in a smaller area nearer transmitters, we want to make sure that we're doing the safe thing. So while, as far as I know, it is a safe technology, I do know that there will still be a lot more experimentation and a lot more testing that needs to be done to make sure that it is 100% safe. And we'll always check that.
Great. Len, do you have time for one more question for us?
I can do one more, sure.
Okay, great. So this one includes a link to a New Yorker article
Yes.
And the article is titled "How Bias in Technology Has Hurt Women's Voices." The article goes on to explain how broadcasters and equipment manufacturers limit their signals to voice band frequencies for AM radio, which reduced the intelligibility of women's voices. It claims that, quote, many data compression algorithms and Bluetooth speakers disproportionately affect high frequencies and consonants, and women's voices lose definition, sounding thin and tinny. Have you observed women being given the advice to lower the pitch of their voices?
Yes. This is all true. And that advice predates all of the technology. Lower voices have been perceived to be more pleasant by audiences than higher voices going back to since it was just AM radio. I can tell you that when I started in radio in the 1980s, one of the first pieces of advice I was given was to take up smoking because it would roughen my voice and lower it and therefore make it more pleasant. I decided that wasn't a trade-off I was willing to make and opted not to, but I've lost a lot of friends in broadcasting too young because they were given that same advice and actually took it. There has always been a preference. If you think of women who have been on broadcast radio, for example, they tend to have lower voices. Voiceover work tends to be done by people with lower voices. So this is as much about the technology as it is a personal preference that most people have and don't realize that they have. I can say that when I am working with students now, I don't give them the advice to work on lowering their voice. I take a different tack with them and I tell them to improve their content. Because one of the things that I found is that one thing that will cut through and one thing that people do find more soothing, for lack of a better word, is hearing something interesting. So we make it a point to spend less time coaching try to get your voice down a little bit, and maybe a little whiskey and cigarettes is not something I would tell a student in 2022. Instead, I would tell them, have a story and tell it well. And people are willing to be a little more forgiving. But it's a battle. We do tend to have a preference for the lower voice of the two. Speaking personally, I feel lucky. I got 2 voice changes in my life. I had a voice change at 14. And I had another one when I was 20. And I have this, some mornings I wake up, I'm afraid I'm going to get another one and that'll be it. But there is a preference for that lower voice. I'm not going to deny what's in that article. It's absolutely true. The technology is only a part of it though. Part of it is also psychological.
Great. Well, thank you for those great answers. There are also a lot of accolades that have come through in the chat expressing thanks and appreciation for the presentation. So
thank you to everybody for attending tonight. It was a great honor for me to be able to do this and be part of this program. And like I say, I'm always happy to talk about radio and science with people.
And folks, we are piloting these for the next 4 total presentations this semester. So we are hoping that you will return at the end of February, at the end of March, and at the end of April for the remaining presentations this winter semester here. We are piloting these, so we really appreciate your feedback. And as I mentioned at the start of the conversation here today, we will be asking you to provide us a little bit of feedback. So please take the time when that email comes through. We will use the email that you registered with when you registered for Zoom here. Len has taken the screen back to the 3 morsels to take away. So as you're leaving, if I had some nice tunes here, I would sort of play some tunes and have you take those morsels away as you waltz out of this virtual Zoom room. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your evening.